Holy Gospel this morning comes from St. John in the 21st chapter. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to him, "I'm going fishing." And they said to him, "We'll go with you." And they went out, got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" And they answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it because there were so many fish. The disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from land, only about 100 yards off. Well, now, when they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread, and Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them, and though there were so many, the net itself was not torn. Well, Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now, none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. So Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. And this is now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. Now, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." And he said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Now Peter felt hurt because he had said to this a third time, "Do you love me?" And so he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." Now very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and go about wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and somebody else will have to fasten your belt around you and take you, maybe where you do not wish to go. He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. And after this, he said to Peter, "Follow me," the gospel of the Lord. You may be seated. There is so much in this story that just confuses me. I'm tempted to just go have breakfast, because who's got some fish? I mean, maybe the strangest thing is that Peter actually gets dressed to jump into the lake because he's naked while he's in the boat. And in my experience, it's usually the other way around, so I'm not going to ask. But I am very impressed that on this particular moment in our Lord and Savior's time with his disciples, that he gives them that final charge to feed the sheep, to tend the lambs, to feed the sheep. And he does it 3 times. And of course, Peter distresses because by the third time he's like, "Come on, Lord, seriously, you know." But on the other hand, Jesus wants to make it pretty obvious and pretty clear what we're all about as followers of him, disciples of him, people of the way, whatever you want to use to describe yourself. Pretty much, as Christians, we feed sheep. It's what we do. And if you look at it, you look at Jesus and his life, Gospel of Luke, for example, Jesus, all he ever does, he heals a few people, but most of the time he's sitting around at dinner or lunch or breakfast, or having a dinner or having a lunch or having a breakfast, or just came from a lunch or just came from a dinner or just came from a breakfast. It's so bad that usually when I'm reading the Gospel of Luke, I have to have a sandwich because you just get hungry. And here in the Gospel of John, Jesus says, breakfast, most important meal of the day. By the way, how many of you have not had breakfast yet? Not had breakfast. Okay, just the bell choir. Okay, good. we're going to expect either a very slow song Chio or a very fast one, depending on how badly they want to get to the donuts. But we all know breakfast is the most important meal of the day, and I suppose for many of you, you take it where you can and eat what you can. But of course, it's never just about the food, never just about breakfast. Meals are not just about food, just about breakfast. Meals are a time for a community to gather together. Meals are a time for a community to articulate its identity, who it is, what God has asked them to do, who God has asked them to be. To gather around a meal is to be able to gather and to be able to say, this is who we are, and whether it is an informal night of ham and beans in front of the TV, hoping that your internet will hold out so you can watch all 24 episodes of Scandal and Netflix, or whether it is a formal dinner, maybe like the wedding reception I was at last night, whatever the case may be. It is a chance to say, this is who I am, this is who we are, this is what we're about. And I learned that lesson very young. And I learned it, of all places, at Trinity Lutheran Church in Duluth, Minnesota. It was the church of my grandparents. And for the young folks in this congregation, you may not actually believe what I'm about to say. Some of you older folks may have a memory of it as well. But there was a time at Trinity Lutheran Church where everybody after service went and had cake and coffee every Sunday. It was served on china, and there were doilies on the tables. The women wore hats, and the men wore suits. I kid you not, every Sunday. And the beauty of it was that my grandfather, as the head usher, had to go down at the second service and make sure that everything was ready. Conveniently, he did that just about the time the preacher got up to preach. And we would go downstairs, and they had these mammoth, to me, I'm a little kid. I'm 5, 6 years old. I got older as time went on, but they had these mammoth coffee urns. There were 2 of them. They stood on the counter. They were 3 feet high. I don't know how much coffee they made, but they served them, in those china cups that only hold, like in my parlance, basically a swallow. And but it seemed to be enough for my grandma. She could make one of those cups last until Tuesday. They were always shiny and gleamy. And I remember as a kid, I'd go down and I'd see these huge urns of coffee just kind of percolating and bubbling up and giving that aroma of Lutheran coffee, which is basically just water that's colored brown. And of course, the cakes and the cookies and the desserts were laid out on the tables, usually artfully arranged. There was always one woman. One of them had to sacrifice to sit there at that table and protect it from the ushers and the ushers' grandchildren. And she sat there dutifully knitting or doiling or tatting or whatever women in those days did. Usually it involved string and some form of a sharp instrument that could slap my hand should I reach for a cookie. And then on Sunday morning after that service, they would all file downstairs, single file. Everybody was polite. The women would serve, and everybody would know that this is Trinity Lutheran Church. Good bunch of Norwegians that made it to Duluth and thought it looked enough like Norway that they'd stop. Look, rocks, snow, frozen tundra. We're home. I'm going to say about 6 years ago now, one of my students was a pastor at Trinity Lutheran Church in Duluth. And I found out about that. I was like, wow, tell me, what's it like to be the pastor at Trinity Lutheran Church in Duluth, Minnesota, after all these years? I haven't been back in decades. And he said, well, we're struggling. He said, there's not much going on anymore, and We're thinking we may have to close. That's why I'm here. Can you help me fix it? I was like, well, yeah, I don't know. I said, tell me about your coffee pots. He said, what? I said, tell me about the coffee pots. Here's my enduring memory of Trinity Lutheran Church. These silver gleaming coffee pots. He said, we don't have those anymore. I've never seen them. When Jesus says, feed my sheep, he's not only talking spiritually. He's talking about actually putting food in people's bodies. And if you lose the connection between putting food in people's bodies and exploring and enjoying the Spirit of Christ that lives inside of those bodies, if you can't do both of those things, you've missed the point of what Jesus told Peter. Because to feed sheep is to feed them both physically and spiritually. It's not to do one at the expense of another. And too often, as congregations, we focus on one side or the other. We focus on feeding people physically, and so we do a lot of ministries. Like next week, for example, it will be Bread for the World, an important and huge ministry to feed actual bodies, to put actual bread into the mouths of people, to put fish in people who are hungry, to put clean water in people who do not have it. And organizations like Bread for the World, or our own Joseph's Coat, or any of the things that happen are vital to understanding how to live our faith in Jesus Christ. But it is not just about the food we put in people's mouths. It is the food in which we celebrate their souls and the gifts that God has given them. And that food has to be nourished as well. Nourished with companionship, friendship, love, maybe a hymn, maybe a baptism, maybe a prayer. To be able to feed the soul is as vital to feeding sheep as to feed their bodies. And for the Christian church and those who follow Jesus Christ, it is a constant balance between feeding the soul and feeding the body. And if you lose one or the other, you have lost it all. You have lost it all. Because the point is not to just feed bodies or just feed souls, but to feed them both in that balance. And to allow people to see that the God who has made this wonderful world, this God who gives us food to eat, gives us friends to celebrate that food with, gives us huge coffee urns and cakes, is exactly the same God who wants to see you free. To understand that the guilt and the sin and the shame that you carry with you does not debilitate you tomorrow, but instead that you can lay it here, at that font, at this altar, and you can go through those doors free. And the reason, perhaps, why Jesus had to remind Peter 3 times to feed sheep, because he just didn't want him to think about it in terms of fish, and he didn't want to think about it just in terms of prayer. But he wanted Peter to see that what Jesus was about was feeding bodies and souls. And what we do as Christians is work to feed bodies and souls. We are not just in the business of helping make this world a fuller place, but it is a great ministry to be able to help those who do not have enough to eat. But we are not also in the business of making this world a secluded cloister in which only prayers are allowed, and the little children starve, and the widows die of thirst. We are people who have been charged by our God to go through those doors and feed bodies and souls. That the feeding that we do comes not only from the great silver urns that give us coffee, but it also comes from the silver urn that lives inside each of us. A cherished heart that God has emboldened to be able to talk about love,
to be able to share hope, to be able to live dreams. And what Jesus reminded Peter years ago was not that Peter was going to forget to eat breakfast, but that what we are about in our eating breakfast is celebrating the life that we have been given by God. And that, my friends, never goes away, even if you skip a meal or two. Amen. Let's stand and sing.